Hey, so does anybody remember a really good high school or middle school fight? Anybody? There was a fight that I remember in middle school. It was like the first one that I remember being like a crazy fight. Who knows what in the world led up to it? But there was this girl. Girl fights are always better than guy fights. You know that? Like, girls are crazy. Guys are just like, I'm going to hit you one time really hard and like we'll kind of wrestle and that's it. Girls are nuts. So there was this girl who was angry at another girl for, I don't know. And so she took I'll never forget this in my whole life. She took a combination lock and put the loop around her finger and then clasped the other end and, yelled probably obscenities at the other girl. And then the other girl turned, just clocked her in the head. Now she was really stupid about it because my middle school principal he was still in the Air Force reserves. He had been in the Air Force previously and he was still in the reserves. And he was like, you didn't mess with him. And she did this right outside the main office, which was dumb, okay? If you're gonna fight, be smart about where you do it. Also, I'm going to tell you later, don't fight, so ignore me now. So right outside, just clock this girl, and then it went crazy, right? And you know how any good middle school or high school fight is. You have three different types of people. You have the fighters. Usually it's just the two who started it, but sometimes people get a little antsy and they'll jump in too, right? Got those two. Then you've got the inner circle, which are the ones going, fight, 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 fight. And they're like crowding in closer and closer. And then you've got the ones on the outside who are like, what's happening? What? I don't understand. What's going on right now? That's kind of like what the world's like politically right now, isn't it? I got to thinking about this. It's like the perfect metaphor. You've got the Republicans and the Democrats, and they're just trying to kill each other. And then you've got a whole bunch of people who are like, this is awesome, fight, fight. And then you've got a whole lot of people around the outside going, what's happening? Why are we so mean to each other? So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's just like two kids going at each other. The problem with a fight is that if there's nobody to break up the fight, who knows what's going to happen, right? That fight in particular, it didn't last very long. Like I said, she started it right outside the office. Mr. Mazzy was out there now, and he took care of business. It was taken care of. He was in the middle breaking them apart. But in politics, nobody's breaking it up, are they? It's just people wailing on each other constantly. And there's a bigger problem than that. See, too often, the church are not the spectators on the outside going, what's happening? The church are also not often the ones who are in the inner circle going, fight, fight. Too often, the church is one of the two parties that's doing the fighting. That's not the job that we should have. That's not what we should be doing. But especially historically in America, the church has been one of the people that's in the middle of the fight. We've loudly and proudly said, you're a problem to us. You've wronged us. We've got to set things right. And the church has done everything we can to destroy any viewpoint except ours. And that's a problem. I was doing some research on this, and I was a youth pastor for about 10 years before we started this church. And when I was a youth pastor, I was very well kind of immersed and engaged in youth culture and youth kind of church trends and things like that. And I hadn't looked these numbers up for a while. In 2011, there was a book that came out that was fantastic by a guy named Dave Kinnaman. And Dave Kinnaman now is a part of the Barna Research Group, if you're familiar with Barna. They do primarily religious surveys and studies and things. And they just revised their study from 2011 where they were looking at the percentage of teenagers who grow up with a church background that then leave the church in their 20s. And that number, as of 2019, was 64%. 64%. In 2011, it was 59%, which at the time, nobody had done a comprehensive study on this. It was a mind-blowing statistic. And now here we are, a little less than 10 years later, 8 years later, and that's risen by 5 percentage points to 64% of teenagers who grow up with a church background who leave the church in their 20s. Now, in some cases, they come back, but in many cases, they don't. Just out of curiosity, is anybody here willing to admit that that was them? That they left as a teenager or in their 20s and pretty much never wanted to come back? Yeah, so we've got a handful in this room. Interestingly, when Barna has done this research, they've looked not just at how many are leaving, but why. And one of the top reasons in any survey, any study that's ever been done on this topic is politics. that the church is either too political or political in the wrong ways. That's a problem. If the church, if we are driving away 64% of our teenagers, in part because of the way we handle politics, maybe instead of doing what the church has done historically, which is say it's all their fault, maybe we should look in the mirror and we should ask, what's our role been in this? And what can we do differently moving forward? Believe it or not, Jesus talked about this. Not directly. I mean, Barna hadn't done the study then. But Jesus talked about this. What he said is foundational to not only surviving an election, which is kind of this whole Purple Jesus series idea, but it's critical for any church that is going to step into the future and thrive and make a difference in the lives of people. It's critical that we get this right. So in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus begins what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. It's the most famous sermon Jesus ever gave. It's like Jesus often did kind of short form teaching. He didn't do these long messages, but the Sermon on the Mount he did. I mean, he talked for a long time and he just, a lot of instruction, a lot of really practical things. At the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, he gave what are known as the Beatitudes. And if you've been in church, you've heard these. All right, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, all these things. The very next thing that Jesus did was he addressed exactly what the church has gotten wrong. Well, more specifically, he addressed what the church's role is and what we should be doing. But in it, he gives a warning. And the warning is, if you don't get this right, people are going to find you worthless. And that's exactly what's happened in the modern church in America. So let me read this to you. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 13, Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless." Do you see it? Jesus is talking to his followers. He's talking to the people who were the beginnings of the church. The church, as it exists now, did not exist then. But people were beginning to follow Jesus, and he's teaching. He said, hey, your job is to be salt. A couple years ago, my dad got sick and he had to go on a sodium-free diet. That food's terrible. Anybody ever had to eat on a sodium-free diet? It's awful. I mean, you get used to it over time, right? But like when you start eating sodium-free, it's like there's no flavor in anything. It's just gone. I mean, we're so used to it. You ever look on the sodium content on the food that you eat? It's kind of terrifying. There is so much in all of it. Why? Because it tastes good and because it brings out the flavor of everything else. That's what it does. Like it's awesome at it. Also melting snow and ice. If it does that, who knows what it does inside us? You ever think about that? Like that's one of those things. Sorry. Sometimes the ADHD, I can't control it. It just takes me over. So salt. It makes stuff taste good. It brings flavor. Jesus says, your job is to be flavor to everything around you. It's to bring out the good. And he says, but what happens if it loses that? It's completely worthless. See, what the American church has done wrong, I think, is that we've lost our saltiness. Like we've made so many things that shouldn't have mattered that much into the things that are critical. And people aren't stupid. So over time, people look at what the church does and they're like, this is terrible. This is worthless. Let me read you what Jesus says after this. He says, you are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that can't be hidden. Nobody lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. So Jesus gives two images here of what the job, the role, the purpose of the church is: to be salt and to be light. To be salt, to give flavor to everything, to everyone around. And to be light, like a lamp on a stand. What happens when you put a light up high? It gives light to everything. We had this illustrated really well, actually, just in the last week. On Tuesday, or on Monday, our power went out during the storms, and there was a tornado warning. Many of you were in it, and so the power had already gone out, so we went down, or it went out while we were in the basement. I don't remember. Either way, we were in the basement of my parents' house. We were visiting with them when it all happened, and the power went out. And my kids, they don't handle stressful situations with calmness. I'll just say that, okay? They are not cool, calm, and collected. You can decide which parent they may or may not have gotten that particular personality trait from. I may or may not have been out watching for the tornado, because Midwestern boy, while the rest of my family was huddled in the basement like, it's going to kill us, we're going to die. Actually, Vanessa did pretty well. She was very calm and cool and collected. Our kids were not. And so as the power's out down in the basement and the storm's rolling in, it got really dark down there. Like, there are windows down there, but it got really dark. And so my parents have these really cool little LED lanterns, and they're small, but they have 4 of them, and they brought them down. And of course, the kids, they want to play with them, and so they're like setting them down on the ground. Well, interestingly, when the lantern's on the ground, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. And then I picked one up and I set it on top of a thing of boxes. And the 4 lanterns lit up the entire basement. Not when they were on the floor, but when they were up high. Jesus says that's your job, to be salt and to be light, like a light that's placed up on top of a stand that brings light into the whole house. And this is what the church has gotten wrong. So let's go back to the fight analogy. If our job is to be salt and to be light, then who are we in the fight? Are we the people standing in the back going, what's happening? Nope. Are we the people huddling around going, fight, 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 fight? No. Are we the ones in the middle doing the fighting? No. We're the one who breaks up the fight and reminds everybody that we have things in common and that we're on the same team, that we're all humans, that we all bleed the same blood, and that the things that divide us are not as important as the things that unite us. That's the church's job. But we've abdicated that job because we're too busy fighting with the other side. If I could kind of summarize it, this is what I think. I think we are known by what we are against, and we should be known by who we are for. I mean, we've messed that complete. We've gotten that so backward. And so there's an entire generation that now is going, this is worthless to me. In fact, maybe even more than that, I think that there's an entire generation and an entire world, frankly, at this point, that looks at the church and they don't even care that we say we have a message of hope, because all they see in our actions is a message of death. Now, some of you are sitting here and you're going, yeah, but that's not me. And that very well may be true. It's a little bit interesting because we started this church to be a church for broken people and for people who don't like church and all that stuff. But at some point in time, you kind of become a church person when you're a part of a church for a long time, Like some of you have been here now for a couple years and it's like, yeah, you're a church person now. Ha, ha, ha. And so here's the thing, even if you're not that person, I need you to understand that that's the way, the way that you have looked at the church historically, that's still the way people see the church. It hasn't changed. It's getting worse. We have so messed this up. People can't even hear our message of hope because historically we have given such a message of just death and division and condemnation. This is terrible because we've just completely abandoned what we're called to be salt and to be light. It's critical that the church starts shining again. Of all the times in human history that the church ought to be standing up and offering hope to the hopeless and peace to the broken, building bridges and helping mend relationships. 2020? Come on. That's the time. But people don't think we can. And it's getting worse because it's an election. Now, let's just call a spade a spade. Historically, which side of the political aisle has the church been associated with? Yeah, Republicans. All of you are like, I'm not saying it, because if there's Republicans in here, I don't want them mad at me. Thank you, Ashley. I can always count on you. right? Historically, the Republicans, the evangelical church in America has been directly associated with the Republican Party. And that's a shame. And if you're a Republican here, you're probably getting a little nervous. Because you're like, where are we going with this? I told you last week, I'm not telling you what my particular political leanings or affiliations are, and I'm standing by it. You're not gonna know. But I told you last week that Jesus isn't a Republican or a Democrat. He's not. The church has become known as being one thing, but that one thing is not who Jesus was. It's not who Jesus would be if he was here today. Last week, it was all about how Jesus would have risen above that and he would have been purple. I believe that. Jesus was a bridge builder. He was a unifier. He was a person who took people on the margins and tried to bring them together, united under him, not under a party affiliation. The church in America is known for being this, evangelical right wing, believe in all these, depending on where you are in the particular political spectrum, either crazy things or great things. And that's the problem, isn't it? They're either great or they're terrible. But what if they're neither? What if they're just things? What if they're just things that we see depending upon our particular background, our particular experiences? What if in some cases they're things that are based purely on ignorance? And what if in some cases they're things based purely on arrogance? See, I could make the case that Jesus is a Republican, biblically. I could also make the case Jesus is a Democrat. And if you're a Republican, you'd probably agree with everything I said on one side and disagree with everything on the other. And if you're a Democrat, you'd flip it. Because we like to make that book say anything we want it to. When what Jesus said all along is be salt and be light. He never said be right. Ever. He never said get it right. Make sure you stand for the right things and stand against the wrong things. He didn't say that. He said, stand for people. Stand for people. Now, that gets a little bit dicey because there are right things and there are wrong things. But when we major on the things and we forget about the person, we're not doing what Jesus did. Jesus never looked at people, with the exception of the religious elite. He never looked at people and condemned them immediately. He never looked at people and called out all of their behavior and their action immediately. He loved people where they were. He asked questions. He got to know people. He showed them that he cared. And then he got to the issues. The church hasn't done that. The church has been known historically by what we're against. We have this list in the evangelical church. There are these, listen, I grew up in the evangelical church, so I'm very well versed in all this. With all the different things, all the different, you know them. This is the way we look at this. 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 And these are right. So we must believe them and we must stand for them. All the while crushing people who don't see it the way we do. And for some of you, you're like, yeah, that's exactly why I left church. Because I read about this Jesus who was full of love and Christians were the worst. Why? Because we put policies over people. We put politics before people. There's nothing wrong with being a Republican. There's nothing wrong with being a Democrat. There's nothing wrong with leaning right wing. There's nothing wrong with leaning left wing. There's nothing wrong with being terrified right now for the future of our country because you think that we're going to hell in a handbasket, or for being terrified for the future of our country because you think we don't care about anybody and we just try to bowl every. There's nothing wrong with seeing things either way. There is something wrong with killing people in the process. The church was called to be salt and to be light. And if you're a Christian, even if you're not a church person, that means you. Because the church is every person that's a follower of Jesus in the world. The capital C church, the church. It's you and it's me. And the church will never be able to reclaim what it was supposed to be if we as individuals don't step up and reclaim it, starting with our own individual lives. Now, let's look at what this actually looks like. Like, how do we shine? Philippians chapter 2 is one of my favorite passages, and it's actually right before this, kind of leading into it, but it's one of my favorite portions of all of the scriptures. The Apostle Paul writes this. Dear friends, you always followed my instructions when I was with you. And now that I'm away, it's even more important. Work hard to show the results of your salvation, obeying God with deep reverence and fear. For God is working in you, giving you the desire and power to do what pleases him. Then look, I don't like this verse. Do everything without complaining or arguing. I don't like that one. There's more I don't like later. So that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. You know what the evangelical church in America generally focuses on in that verse? Crooked and perverse people, right? That wasn't the point. The point was that the church, Christians, shine bright when what? When we work hard to show the results of our salvation, obeying God and not complaining and arguing. Well, that's a little different. Work hard to show the results of your salvation. Listen. Working hard to show the results of our salvation doesn't earn us anything. But without some action to follow up what God did in us, it doesn't mean anything. Right? Like, if our lives don't change at all when we come to Jesus, then did we really come to Jesus? If you get married and you change nothing in your life, then did you actually get married? And is that relationship going to go anywhere? No. Work hard to show the results of your salvation. See, here's the thing, man. Like, following Jesus, I've said this so many times, following Jesus is very, very simple, but it's really difficult sometimes. Why? It's simple. It's not complicated. But it's hard because it involves us putting ourselves completely aside. And we don't like to do that. Obeying God. Doing everything without complaining or arguing. Doesn't that sound nice? Some of you are like, no, that sounds terrible. When you do that, you'll shine bright in a world that's very, very dark. When we live that way, we shine bright. Why? Because nobody lives that way, right? Like nobody. Paul writes this in the book of Titus. Do not get involved in foolish discussions about spiritual pedigrees or in quarrels and fights about obedience to Jewish laws. These things are useless and a waste of time. I really like that verse. I like this. They're useless and they're a waste of time. Now, in case you aren't entirely sure what he means here, let me modernize this a little bit, okay? Do not get involved in foolish discussions. These discussions are dumb. Foolish discussions about who is more spiritual. Okay? Are Republicans more spiritual or are Democrats? Paul's like, that's a stupid question. That's dumb. Or in quarrels and fights about obedience to Jewish laws. Okay, good. Well, we aren't in fights about Jewish laws, so my side's right. No. See, the fight between the Jews and the Gentiles, which, by the way, was a historically ugly fight, the fight between these two groups, it was about who was right and who was wrong. The Jewish people believed that in order to follow Jesus, you had to become a Jew, which meant following all 600 and whatever laws from the Old Testament, including the big hang-up for many Gentiles was that Jewish men got circumcised. Gentile men didn't. And to be a Jew, you had to get circumcised. And so the first fight in the church, you know what it was? Hey, do the men who are now following Jesus have to get circumcised? And the Gentile men are like, nope, if that's it, I'm out. Like that was actually the first fight in the church. Now we fight about carpet and music. That's way less important. That was the first fight. Okay, so what was it? It was, in order to be right, you have to do this thing. Well, that sounds a little bit like the way it is now. This is the right way to believe, and if you don't believe it this way, if you don't see it this way, then you're wrong, and there's a divide between us. You're the enemy because you don't see things this way. If you don't do things our way, then you can't be a part of this. Do not get involved in foolish discussions about who is more spiritual, or in quarrels and fights about who's right about stuff. Those things are useless and a waste of time. I would love to know what Paul would have to say about Facebook. Listen, if you're posting articles on Facebook about politics, it's useless and a waste of time. Period. You might not feel like it is, but here's why. I promise you with 100% absolute certainty, no one has read your article and gone, oh, yeah, I've seen the world completely wrong all these years. It hasn't happened, and it's not going to. Also, when you wade into that argument because all these people are idiots and you wade into the argument, nobody is going, you're right. Can't believe I never saw it that way. It's useless. And it's a waste of time. How many arguments, like legitimate arguments, have you ever been in your entire life where somebody at the end has been like, you've completely changed my entire worldview? Any? I'm a really good arguer. I'm real good at it. And I can't convince anybody of anything. It's a waste of time. It's useless. Does that mean there's anything wrong with having those opinions? No. But be careful how you use them. James, the brother of Jesus, said this, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. I don't like that verse. Never have. Because it's tough. But how much different would things be if all the politicians in the world lived by that principle? Like really? How much different would our world be? If politicians were quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, how much different would the world be if Christians lived that way? Because we don't. Historically, the evangelical church has really not lived that way. But the deeper that I see some of this stuff go, the more I'm starting to see now Christians who are on the other side of the fence, who in, I think, well-meaning reaction and intention to perhaps what they've seen now are doing the exact same thing, just angry and bitter and hateful toward everybody that doesn't see things there. See, this is not a right or a left thing. This is a people thing. I mean, Jesus talked about it. Paul wrote about it. James, the brother of Jesus, writes about it. Like, we aren't the first people in human history to get mad at one another. We're not the first people in human history to be divided over things that we are convinced we are right about. People problems are the same problems today that they were 2,000 years ago. The principles of how we deal with it haven't changed. What does it look like to be a follower of Jesus in an immensely politically divided climate? Well, it means obeying God with reverence and fear and doing stuff without complaining or arguing. It means not getting involved in foolish discussions about who's right and who's wrong because it's useless and a waste of time. It means being quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. Just yesterday, I commented on a thing on Facebook. I don't usually do this, but I thought that I had the relationship with the guy to do it. And so he posted this meme that I didn't understand. It seemed very offensive to me. And I wanted to understand his perspective. And so I posted on it, and I started it with, this is a legitimate question. Because you can't ask anything online without you got to preface it. I'm not being a jerk. I really want to know. I said, this is a legitimate question. How is this different than this other thing? I'm trying not to give too much away here. And we had a really productive discussion about it. Because I wasn't trying to tell him he was wrong. I wasn't trying to tell him he needed to see things my way. You know what's interesting? I don't think he moved one step, and I don't think I moved one step. But we found common ground in the fact that we didn't have to kill each other over our differences. And it was really good. And honestly, as the discussion happened, and a couple of different people waded in on it, but it was a really productive conversation. I had this moment where I thought, man, I hope people see this thread. Because we don't have to hate each other if we don't see things the same. We can be kind, and we can be generous, and we can be loving. We can be like Jesus with the people who are very different than us. And in some cases with people who have fundamentally different ideas about what is right and what is wrong. See, ultimately, I think that, and this is a really challenging thing. I had some better phrasings and things for this, but ultimately, I think if the church's role is to shine bright into a world that's filled with darkness, I think that this is what the church should be doing right now. To shine bright, don't fight. I had more complicated things than that, and I kept going back to this, no, this needs to be really, really simple. Just don't fight. Refuse to be a part of the fight because it's useless. Instead, right before this in Philippians 2, it's one of my favorite passages in all the scriptures. I shared Philippians 2 starting in 13. If you want to look back at the beginning of chapter 2, it's incredibly beautiful. It talks about Jesus, who is the Son of God, and how he humbled himself. And our attitude should be the same as him, that we should think of others as better than ourselves, because Jesus left the throne of heaven to come to earth. He was made into a servant when he didn't have to. He was the Prince of Heaven, and he came here to be a servant and to die just because he cares about us. And that's what the church is called to. You can't be light if your message is full of darkness. You can't be salty if your message is bitter. To shine bright, don't fight. What does that look like day to day? Really, I talked about Facebook earlier, but probably don't wade into stuff on Facebook. Really, just stay out of it. You're not going to change anybody's mind. And if people know you're a Christian, please hear me. They're going to look at what you have to say and they're going to go, this is why I hate Christians. Because they don't listen. They don't care about anybody else's experience. They just see things their way. And that might be an unfair statement about you, but it's not an unfair statement about the church historically. I've been a part of the church my whole life, so I'm self-condemning here, okay? Maybe take time to ask some questions and actually listen to the answers. You may not move in the way you see things, but you might build a bridge. Choose to respect those you disagree with. They're people, like you and I. One of my all-time favorite Saturday Night Live skits, which I don't ever watch it anymore, it's kind of terrible now, but one of my all-time favorite ones. Anybody remember the, oh my goodness, I'm going to totally blank on it right now. Christopher Walken, when he was the record producer. Cowbell, there we go, Cowbell. Anybody remember that? Man, that skit's funny. My favorite line in that skit is, I put my pants on just like the rest of you, one leg at a time. Except once my pants are on, I make gold records. That's really good. We all put our pants on the same, one leg at a time. We all bleed the same blood. Take time to listen and show some respect to people who see things differently. You might find that you actually have some things in common. Choose to see the other side of issues. If you can't see the other side of an issue, choose to talk to somebody who sees it differently than you with love and respect and with kindness. Choose to believe the best in people. You know, the people who are on the other side aren't all out to get you. Some of them might be. Don't talk to them. That's not going to be a productive conversation. But not all of them are. Choose to see beyond red and blue. Because our God isn't either one of them. If we were to sit down and I was to ask you if you could snap your fingers and make one thing in the world change, or you could make the world just different somehow, what would it be? My guess is that all of you would give some version of peace, love, unity, we'd stop killing each other, we'd stop fighting all the time. It would be some form of that, right? We all want the world to be full of more peace and more love and more kindness. We, as Christians, we want the world to be more full of Jesus, don't we? Who's going to usher that in if the church won't? I don't know what the next year is going to look like as a church. We're going to talk about what I think it might some next week. I don't know what it's going to look like. But what I know is that if the church doesn't step up in the midst of the most divided season that I can ever remember in my lifetime, In the midst of an election that on its own is so immensely divided, if the church can't step up in these seasons to bring unity and to bring healing and to bring wholeness and to bring people together, then what are we doing at all? I know that for me and for our church, I want to be a beacon of hope. I want our church to be like a city that's on a hill that shines light to everybody around us. I want our church to be a church that is known not by what we are against, but by who we are for. We're for God and we're for people. I want our church to be a church that if we were suddenly removed from this community, people would go, no, that can't happen. They're doing too many good things here, and they're not asking for anything back from it. And I want all of you to be on that journey with me. Because I could do some of that on my own, but it wouldn't be that much fun. And I like you all too much. And we can do so much more together. So my commitment to you is that we are going to drive forward as hard as we can to be a church that unites instead of divides, that isn't afraid to stand up for what we think is right, but that does it with kindness and with love and respect, that isn't afraid to stand for injustice, because, by the way, Jesus made a big deal of that, but that doesn't do it by destroying the people who don't see things the same way we do. My commitment is that we're going to drive forward on that as hard as we possibly can. But we are we. We can't do that if you won't do that with me. And so I want to invite you to go on that journey with me, whatever it looks like over the next year, beginning just this week by simply asking God, what is there in my life that divides instead of unites? What is there in my life politically that I need to calm down on? How in my life can I take steps this week to put people over politics instead of the other way around? And just see where God leads you. Is that fair? Jesus wasn't red or blue, and we shouldn't be either. We can have the opinions, but ultimately, we don't serve a political party. We don't put our hope in a presidential candidate because they've all been in Washington too long and they'd have made a difference by now if they were going to anyway. We put our hope in our Savior and our King, the Son of God, who, when he didn't have to, left the throne of heaven to pay a price for us we could never pay, to restore our relationship with God and to give us the job of restoring relationships in this world. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for how much you love us. God, thank you that when we were apart from you, when we were different than you, when we were divided from you, when we didn't see things your way, when we weren't doing things your way, God, that you sent your Son for us. And God, in this moment, I ask that for every person in this room, whatever our relationship with you is, wherever we are in that journey, that you would give us a heart first for people. God, that you would begin to break our heart for the things that break yours. Not for the things we like, not for the things that think we're best, but God, that our hearts would begin to break for the things that break your heart. That we would begin to see the people around us who see things differently than us, not as our enemies, not as our adversaries, but simply as our brothers and sisters, period. God, that we wouldn't make our lives about how right we are, but that we would make our lives about pointing people to you and your love and your goodness. God, for each of us, show us what is inside us that needs to change. Give us the courage and the strength to step wherever it is that you want us to step, and surround us with people who can help us along the way. We love you and we're thankful for you. In your name we pray today. Amen.